Welcome to our geopolitical explainer. So, what happens when a war of words between two of the world's biggest leaders spills over into a massive trade battle? Today, we're going to break down how just one public comment might have kicked off a huge 50% tariff and sent some major ripples across the globe.
Yeah, it really all boils down to this one number, 50%. That is the absolutely massive tariff India is now looking at for goods it sends to the US, all because of a sudden 25% hike. Now, this isn't just some routine tweak. Our sources are framing this as a straight-up penalty, and it's at the heart of a pretty high-stakes international standoff. So you have to ask, right? How did we get here so fast?
Well, according to the material we've looked at, the answer isn't buried in some complex economic report. Nope. This whole thing seems to have started not in a trade meeting, but from a public argument between leaders. Let's trace the steps and see exactly how it all went down. Okay, to really wrap our heads around that 50% number, we've got to go back to the very beginning. The spark that lit the whole fuse. And it really did start with a direct clash of words. This right here, this is the moment everything changed. On one side, you have President Trump, who claimed that he personally brokered a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. But then on the other side, you have India's prime minister, who in parliament basically said, no, that's not what happened. We act only in our own national interest. Our sources point to this direct public contradiction as the real trigger for everything that happened next.
And wow, the fallout was fast. I mean, look at this timeline. It suggests a pretty clear tit for tat. Almost immediately after that statement in India's parliament, the White House drops the news of this new 25% tariff, pushing the total up to 50%. The sheer speed of it all suggests this was less about policy and way more about direct retaliation.
Now, officially, the White House didn't point to that public disagreement. The reason they gave, the on-the-record justification for the tariff, was something totally different. It was framed as a penalty because India was buying oil from Russia.
But here's where that official story starts to look a little shaky. Our sources point out this one key fact. Yeah, India buys Russian oil, but China? China buys way more. So you gotta wonder, why did India get slammed with a 50% tariff while China got no new penalty? This selective targeting is what's presented as the biggest piece of evidence that the real reason wasn't about oil, but about that ego clash over the ceasefire claim. So with all this pressure, what did India do? Did it back down? Not at all. Instead, it started its own game of diplomatic chess, making a series of really strategic moves to send a very, very clear message back. India's countermove was this powerful two-step, and it was aimed squarely at the two countries the U.S. worries about most, Russia and China. First, the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval was sent to Moscow. And second, a major state visit to China for Prime Minister Modi was put on the calendar. Let's break down why both of these moves were such a big deal. Okay, with this first move, the timing was everything. The security meeting with Russia, it's an annual thing and it usually happens in September. But by deliberately moving it up to August, right in the heat of this tariff fight, India sent a signal you just can't miss. This was not business as usual. It was a clear message saying, we stand by our ties with Moscow, directly in the face of U.S. pressure. The second move was maybe even more powerful, symbolically. The announcement of Prime Minister Modi's trip to China is huge. It's his first visit in 6 years, and critically, it's the first since that major border clash back in 2020. To announce this kind of warming of relations at this exact moment, well, that was a massive diplomatic statement, signaling India was ready to rethink its alliances in the region based on U.S. actions. All right, so let's zoom out a bit. This whole back and forth between the U.S. and India, it's not happening in a bubble. Our sources connect it to a much bigger story, a pattern of rising tension between the United States and the entire BRICS group of nations. Just take a look at these numbers. India is not alone here. Other major BRICS members are also getting hit with heavy U.S. tariffs. You see, Brazil is also at 50%, and South Africa is at 30%. This really does look less like a one-off problem and more like a clear pattern of economic pressure being put on this entire bloc. And as you can see here,
The friction goes way beyond just tariffs. According to the source, every single one of the 5 original BRICS nations is currently in a tense spot with the U.S. You've got sanctions on Russia, political disputes with Brazil's Lula. It really paints a picture of an entire bloc of nations feeling squeezed by American policy.
And then there's this really fascinating signal that came out of Moscow, a news report saying that India and China had both rejected the U.S. ultimatum, was reposted by Alexander Dugin, a political strategist often called Putin's brain in the media. This quiet little repost is being seen as a subtle but official nod from Russia acknowledging a kind of united front.
Okay, that was a whole lot of geopolitical maneuvering, so let's try to boil this all down into 3 really important things to take away from this whole situation.
So let's put it all together. First, it really looks like this whole thing was sparked by a war of words, not some dry trade policy. Second, India isn't just sitting back and taking it. It's making some seriously bold diplomatic moves toward Russia and China. And finally, remember, this isn't just about India. It seems to be part of a much bigger trend where the BRICS nations are finding themselves on the same side, pushing back against U.S. pressure.
So with all these moves and counter-moves, where does this high-stakes game actually go from here? What should we be looking out for?
Well, for its part, India's official position is crystal clear. The government has stated it will take all actions necessary to protect its national interest. That's not ambiguous. That's a clear signal that they are ready to do what they have to do if things continue to escalate.
And that really brings us to the final big question. As you see these 5 major economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, all feeling this U.S. pressure at the same time, you have to ask, could this actually push them into a more formal, unified response? And if it does, could that collective action start to fundamentally change the balance of economic and political power in the world? Thanks for joining today's Explainer.